Um, I guess I want to start out by saying that the, the, the anchor of all of this work is trust and love. Our first principle is love first, then money. So any community of people who have shared interest and trust and interest in developing trust for each other, who have any capacity to move resources, can do it more democratically, more horizontally. And um, we have had several years now of developing, practical. We've got a set of like 10 principles and practices, and one practice, for example, is that it can be kind of challenging when the people who have a stake in the game are at the table, the decision-making table. That's deep democracy, where people who are affected by a decision have a chance to have a say in it. And the way that we do that is that when someone's proposal comes up for discussion, they recuse themselves, they leave the room, and then they're called back in so people can talk about it without them being there. And when we do our proposal reviews, our peer reviews, they're open. People get a chance to give each other honest feedback and ideas. And then we save all of the, grant resource moving related evaluations and thoughts for an anonymous survey, so that people can share their honest thoughts completely anonymously, and then people see them in aggregate. And so we do things like that to protect the relationships with people on the ground. None of those principles really were that well articulated when we started, other than being committed to, we have a couple important commitments that I would say. Our grant criteria has to do with the work needs to support communities on a local and a regional level, needs to be anchored in social justice. The community of the collaboratory is a salad bowl of the frontline organizations that are really centered in justice and working in communities of less resources and privilege, and then frontline allies who may be working in communities of more privilege, but they're really committed to being centering equity and justice and inclusion. And just having those groups together in the same community has been really transformative and educational. That's a difference edge that has meant a lot to all of us. And then also from the feedback that I hear, I shouldn't say everybody, the feedback that I hear, I'm just going to shift gears here. Let me shift to the funder one because I'm noticing the time. Sharing power between the funders and the grantees, where we're just peers, has been very transformative for us. And I can speak for myself. I've been shocked to discover how much power imbalance is really there. And I remember in the beginning of this time, when the first time that Threshold came to the collaboratory and said, we want to give you guys the majority voice in the decision making, people were just shocked. And everybody just jumped in and said, I want to participate in this. And we got, comments from people like Mateo of Movement Generation that this is the first time that he's really seen a funding model where I feel heard. And I remember sitting with Mateo around a table outside at Canticle Farm, and we're like, okay, well, who's going to be on the council? And he's like, well, I think that's a good idea, but, I don't want to do it. And we're like, why not? we need you. And his colleagues are saying, you need to step up, take this power.
Yeah, if I
And
could jump in. I mean, I was sitting at a table, I remember that day, um, with him and his colleagues where he was saying that, and they're all like, what are you thinking? We want you on that council.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then Mateo steps up, and he's an amazing member of the council. And I'm like, well, I can't go raise money. He goes, look, if I can raise money, you can raise money. Go raise that money. It was great. And so he challenged me to step up in my fundraising power, and that's within the Threshold network. I mean, I don't think we've talked about that on this call so much, but I am a member of Threshold and as individual donors. But we have to basically fundraise within the community and tell the story of who we fund and why it's important. And it's a whole system story that is hard for a lot of people to understand, because it's food and water and energy and justice and health, and how do all of those systems work together in a community. And we're watching it break down right now. I guess, so we say that we focus on climate, economy, and justice. We have in our community, and we have funded the most innovative co-op models, such as the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative is on the docket for this year around the country. That I know I went to Kevin Jones's Transform conference. That's where I met Bill last year. And people were talking about these innovative projects. And I'm like, every single one of them was a member of the collaboratory. So I was like, okay, we've got our finger on the regenerative economic pulse. And climate, I did my dissertation on climate, really. That's key to my heart. Although I always wondered whether something like a pandemic was going to hit home faster, and it's bittersweet that it has. So those are the kinds of groups that we fund. I can show you some more information about the what. I can show you a little more information about the how by sharing a screen, but I don't know if that's the right thing to do right now, if I should just answer some questions before I go.
Can you quickly speak of the funders, what type of structure they are?
So the council, yes, we have a loose structure where we call it an aligned giving pool. So the Threshold Foundation is the main funder, and they're the ones that are giving the majority of the grant money. But we have other funders who have been just said, yes, I'll offer this much to the pool, and the council, we add those numbers together, and then the council allocates the money, the percentage of the pool that should go to each of the proposals. And then we go back to the whole funding pool and we say, okay, why don't you guys fund these guys, and you guys fund these guys your own way. There isn't a single fund. We're trying to be as flexible about that as possible. And the Center for Economic Democracy is also a funding structure partner who people can donate to, people and organizations can donate to the Center for Economic Democracy, and that money can get allocated to the pool. Did that answer your question? And, several of our grantees have been co-ops that are using integrated capital models. So we are providing some of the philanthropic startup capital, but they're loan funds. And so I would love to find a way. I mean, I'm really committed to public-private people partnerships that use integrated capital models to fund the transformative systemic work that needs to happen in regions, cities and regions. And I know I'm speaking to the choir here. We have been so far mostly in funding in a philanthropic model, but I would love to be able to jump to something that's an integrated capital model. Just throwing that out there.
Yeah, I have a kind of a follow-up and then a different line of question. On that, I think that's what the Capital Institute and the Regenerative Finance initiative that they're launching, the Regenerative Finance Lab, from our call the other day is seeking to do. So if folks are interested in hearing more about that, I can share a little bit more as sort of I discover. But my question, thank you for reminding me that we met at the conference. Now it all fits together. I hadn't realized that when we were on the call the other day. Thank you, Leslie.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So my question is around the structure of this has the potential for conflicts of interest. And I think that you kind of touched on that in terms of sort of the recusing oneself. But I think that the potential for conflicts of interest really run deeper than that. But at the same time, there's sort of like, it's almost like an inflection point where if it goes one way, it could be a conflict of interest. But the way that I've witnessed this structured, it flips it in the other direction to use that sort of connectivity to its advantage. So I wonder if you could share any thinking that you've done on that line.
Yeah, that's another one of the things that we've, evolved our wisdom about over the years. That's a different principle. We have a whole different conflict of interest practice. We have, the council members have to sign a conflict of interest disclosure with threshold. So that's there. And then we have our own kind of rule of thumb about what constitutes a conflict of interest that we have to disclose to everybody in the room. And we've been able to work out over time, okay, it's okay if you're a partner with another organization, that's not a conflict of interest because we want people to be working together. But if you have a financial interest in this particular proposal, or you have a governance authority in that organization, like you're on its board, then that's something that you have to disclose and you have to recuse yourself. So that's an example of the kind of, specific details of how you deal with conflicts in close relationship that we've had the opportunity to work through.
But I think, Leslie, Bill's pointing to something else when he's talking about this idea that what from one perspective looks like a conflict, from another perspective is actually value creation in terms of connections. Yeah. And I have a feeling, Ryan, you could speak to that very practically as one of the long-time.
And I want to say I have to hop off here to head off to the doctor. And so I could take, maybe one more. I didn't talk about scalability other than to say, just like with everything else, scaling across, things are going to adapt to whatever the situation is. But absolutely, I believe that the principles and practices are scalable in any kind of community that is motivated to share power when sharing wisdom and resources and love.
Yeah, and this actually reminds me that, it would be really wise of us as an organization to kind of lay out our process on paper so that it can be like taken up by other groups, and maybe even do some like trainings and like facilitation of horizontal decision making around collaborative funding and this kind of thing. Because there's really like three main ways I see this expanding, which is one, to grow the TRCC itself, of course, which we're making some great moves to do right now in terms of being able to like open up that aligned giving pool to even more funders. And as we're able to increase the capacity in terms of how much funding we can bring in, then we can of course grow the number of projects that we allocate funding to. The second is to, have other folks create new circles that use this model. And maybe they have a different set of parameters or principles by which they look at and assess projects than we do, or maybe it's very similar, but to basically support other circles in starting new formations that use a similar collaborative funding process. And the third would be to shift and evolve existing philanthropic organizations to become more horizontal and to become more collaborative, which I think there's a huge interest in right now, especially with the last few years of like publications and discussions that have been coming out kind of critiquing the traditional philanthropic paradigm and speaking to some of the shifts that need to happen. So those are like the three ways that I see this growing, and I would love to be part of that, whether that's writing out our process or doing some trainings and how we do what we do so other folks can adopt it. Yeah,
That'd be very welcomed.
Yeah, I think there might be a fourth thing that's emerging as part of this particular inquiry, and now what around the responding to the COVID crisis too, that has some of the aspects of what we're doing, but isn't a funding pool per se. Is more of a call to funders to move money out through a set of different existing initiatives, alliances, networks that have the capacity to do collaborative and democratic funding, and maybe are already doing it to some degree. We have partners like the Climate Justice Alliance that's doing that. The New Economy Coalition is doing that. I think that there may be some global networks. I'm curious if La Vida Campesina is doing it, or Grassroots Global Justice Alliance. But there are these existing infrastructures that have deep connections. Indigenous Environmental Network might be another one that you would know, Mark, have deep connections already to the work being done on the ground that could rapidly move money, and might need some capacity building support to do it, but could rapidly move money out to initiatives that are being highly impacted by the crisis, but are also offering the new paradigm, and are places where that's being nurtured. And so it wouldn't look exactly like what we're doing, and it wouldn't be necessarily a whole new structure, because that feels like it's too hard to stand up in a matter of a few months, right? But it could be some kind of a call that gathers a set of funders and connects them up with a set of intermediaries that are capable of moving that funding out. That's just, I think, a fourth possibility that's showing up for me, particularly as rapid response. So I'm aware we haven't heard much from Suzanne, Ingermeta, Liza, Mark, either Mark. Love to hear some women's voices, actually. Oh, we heard Leslie's, of course. And we also didn't fully answer your question, Bill, about the conflict of interest piece, and how can that be flipped? So I just want to notice that, but maybe just hold that for a second to see if there's some
I'll
other
jump
thoughts,
in,
comments, questions.
Ben. Couple of things that I'm looking for as we expand the projects that we're funding is exactly what you've asked for. As an example, we form a global trust that holds all of the collective assets under a framework where no single corporation or person has any equity or control over it. So it's a board of governors, effectively, that have fiduciary responsibility to ensure that the people that put funding and capital into the trust are appropriately remunerated. But at the same time, the beneficiaries, which are the collective members of the variety companies and projects, are appropriately managed effectively, or compensated. So we have this issue right now of trying to hone out and develop a set of governance principles, which we believe should be something that operates in a generational environment. How do we do this so that the talent, the skill, and the other aspects of these communities grow in a healthy, cooperative way? We've been able to implement some work that came out of the Xerox park called behavioral economics, where everybody has a voice in terms of communicating about their environment or what they see in the company or what they see in the collective organization they're part of, and do it in a productive, active way. So the janitor, can speak up just as much as the president and the CEO. And we've done another thing. We've set boundaries. So no individual is remunerated more than a 15x than the lowest paid individual in the organization. I really don't want CEOs coming in and looking for golden parachutes of hundreds of millions of dollars. That doesn't fit our model. But these are the things that we're out there actually looking for. And it sounds to me like a lot of the philanthropic approaches may be beginning to develop this, but my experience so far, especially now that I can see the impact of the economics due to the virus, is that what I call the carpetbaggers are out in droves. The Chinese have already put together attack squads to go after distressed real estate and distressed companies and other related things all throughout Europe. So philanthropic models can't withstand that attack. You need a model that has got very, very strong, healthy financial capacity that can weather the storm. And that fundamentally is what we have already done. So now it's a matter of collecting partners and like-minded people and putting us under the same roof. Education happens to be one of those. Babcock Ranch, whom I hope to reacquire, will become a training center so people from all over the world can come share their intellectual property and knowledge and skills. So anyway, that's just my 2 cents.
Thanks, Mark. So you're saying you are looking for some more input on some of these kinds of governance principles. You have
Absolutely.
a set that you're working on, but yeah,
Absolutely.
we can have another conversation maybe and point you in some directions.
Good.
Just want to check in with Inger Meta, Suzanne, Liza. And do people want to stop at the top of the hour, or do we want to do the additional 30 minutes? That's another key question here. You're good to keep going. Yeah. If anyone needs to go, we want to maybe make sure we check in with you or meet your needs.
Yeah, I'm going to have to jump off. I actually have a financial meeting here shortly, but
okay.
I've got to
Thanks,
jump.
Mark. Good to see you.
Good.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. And you certainly have my contact information.
Yes, we do. Well, so Bill, maybe quickly, or Inger Meta, were you going to say something?
Yeah, maybe. It's difficult for me to say something because there's so many details I don't know of the reference and the context that you are operating in. But after speaking after Mark and hearing his reference to microfinance, not microfinance, I heard Nokia and the micro village. And in Norway, we have the Norwegian Telecom that is working with microfinancing of women in Bangladesh and the Bangladesh Grameen Bank. So Nokia is Finnish. So I'm really in this European network. I'm working with the Soul community, establishing a shift, a systemic shift for agriculture, which is also including the cotton industry, of course. So we are looking at how we can address the village of 10,000 as to promote the shift and to working with small farmers. And I think your input, Ryan, into permaculture action, and I'm sure that you already have connections to South Africa and Zimbabwe and so, but to really support that even globally from the network of or the know what network, and it's different connections. There's so many beautiful and skilled people in the network, and I think we can do something very unique and productive things. So I'm in from Europe, so I'm kind of a mirror you and say, okay, I'm a bridge, so, and also learning from you. So yeah, and saying that Mark was mentioning a trust. So the Zimbabwe Environmental and Climate Change Trust, I'm the founder of that trust. So there's I've put in place some tools that is able to accelerate things in Southern Africa, and I do it out of climate change.
Zimbabwe Environmental Trust, or was there another word?
No, it's Zimbabwe Environmental Climate Change Education Trust.
Climate Change Education
Trust. So it's own, but it's initiated by me, and it's signed by lawyers in Zimbabwe, and I'm working already with 30 teachers. So we're making a Teachers for Teachers program. And I'll be working, well, tomorrow we're having a tree planting initiative part of that. So the governmental structure is not in place, and yeah, but I'm working on it. Mm-hmm. So thank you.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing I could imagine this sort of disaster collectivism move supporting, that brings together all the, both the immediate and the long-term needs. I have something to say going back to your question about conflict, if you have a minute, Bill. So sure. I think to me this is part of the whole paradigm shift, and it goes to this question of trust and the fundamental shift from a mindset that says we're all competing with one another as separate actors versus all being interdependent and part of one larger superorganism and complex adaptive system. And I think that's that's what has happened within the collaboratory and within the council when it deliberates. People know, yes, at the narrowest sense, we want to be able to talk about, Ryan's project without him in the room because we don't want it to be personal. But at the same time, Ryan has a say, if he's sitting on the council, about everybody else's funding, and it's one pool of money. So more money, for this thing or less money for that, impacts what's available. But I think this sense of the whole is really what so clearly emerges, and you might be able to speak to that too, Ryan, although you're taking out your earplugs, your headset. But that's what I see happening, is that people get that, my thing isn't necessarily the most important thing here. And that if we can't make that shift in our own thinking to understand our interdependence, that's what we're trying to support here. And so this whole notion of conflict of interest, I think, does get flipped and goes away when we recognize that all our interests intertwine. And that's part of what we're modeling.
Yeah, maybe while waiting for Ryan to settle back in there, that's my sense from participating in this. And my sense is that works because it's a coherent community that's able to create that sense of trust. And the challenge, I would say, would be for sort of external perspectives that don't necessarily have that sense of trust that's built on experience. So there's this sort of the outside looking in and saying, well, we hear you that you all trust each other, but if that person looking in from the outside is somehow impacted by that, then that takes a greater degree of complexity to address. And I guess, yeah.
Can you give an example?
Well, so I guess one example that comes to mind, this isn't from a funding perspective, but just sort of central in my mind right now is just working with international NGOs who one sort of assumes that they're operating in good faith, and yet from my direct experience, they actually have lots of conflict of interests baked into what they're doing, precisely because of this competitive mindset where they're competing for the same funding pools. So it's more of in this instance that I'm thinking about, I don't want to go into detail about a particular instance, but that the likes of the WWFs of the world actually have sort of thrive on being the bigger player in the room and essentially having conflict of interest baked into their system, if you will. So that's, I guess that's the context that I'm thinking about, which is slightly different. That's more, again, from the sort of competition between fundees side of things.
Mm-hmm.
And to rebound on this, Bill, I think it's so important to point that out, because these organizations not only hold so much power in terms of where this money is going to go, who they're going to fund, but also in policy making. And that is where part of what you're talking about is, this organization have become businesses rather than nonprofits and or public services company organizations. And the big problem is very often the same, is that the conflict of interest not only lays into who they're speaking to, who they're working with, but where they get the money from. And more of these organizations have become very dependent on extractive industries, the very industry that is supposed to criticize. And that brings a lot of problems. And that's where, for people like me, who's trying to get funding for indigenous people with no strings attached, that's becoming very difficult, because I cannot knock on the door of World Wide Fund or Conservation International or Nature Conservancy and so forth, because they have a totally different set of values and expectations.
Right.
I will go along with what you're saying, Mark, that the big NGOs, it's big business. If you look at the top salary of an NGO CEO, so it's a very top-down hierarchy in this old-fashioned NGOs saving the world, kind of. And but there is something coming now, which is the new grassroots of new dynamic crowdfunding, which is more dynamic and has the agility in this new area of what we're talking about. And I also like to comment this thing about conflict of interest. Yes, absolutely. But if there is kind of an initiative that is one is part of the other, they are kind of interconnected, and the trust between that the group of people that is holding that space is really that they've been working for a long time together. So there is a mind shift existing. And like a conflict of interest, there is in fact, it's like an open door. It's like a synergy of interest. So it's multiply creativity. So it's a pool of creativity. So that's why the collaborative funding of the structure that I know I refer to you all and Ben in the driver's seat for me, because I know him the most, and I haven't met you before. It's really like so this creativity is so important right now, because what I see coming from the fashion business is that every big brand is suddenly having this brilliant idea to make masks. So they get all these productions to gear the products into making masks. And so what then, when it's impossible that everybody's going to have and make masks. And also in this, the fight about the reality as we move along now, the freelancers, the artists, this creative class is really suffering. So that's what. So what's happening now with the COVID is actually a monopoly. It's a limiting. In spite that it pushes to be creative, it's also killing some companies and structures, and that's suffering. So that's where we have to cook up some money and assist the creative field. Print some money.
Yeah. Suzanne, I just sent you some stuff in the chat, kind of to on the side, because it didn't connect to the conversation we're having, but goes back to your vision. So just want to make sure you saw that. I don't know, Bill, about Leslie's white paper draft, if it's ready for prime time or not. So I would check with her first.
I'll hold off. Maybe I'll mention it in the webinar next week.
Yeah, I think you can certainly do that, and I'm sure we could hear back from her within the next day or two on it.
Cool.
Yeah, I think what makes me so happy about this process is that it kind of breaks down the whole propensity that organizations have to like represent them in a certain way over here and then represent themselves in a different way over there, and to like code switch and to kind of present certain things to their funders and supporters and other things to their like movement, allies or like co-organizations or whatever. And it says, okay, we're all going to be, in the same room having these dialogues throughout this process. So we're going to need to learn how to, be comfortable speaking honestly and transparently with one another in a way that, we don't have the opportunity to like hold one conversation over here and then a different one over there. And I've seen it be without even having to, we never say that. We never even frame things that way, but it's just a very, very natural thing that happens when folks know, okay, I'm in this discussion with my, organizational peers, with other, folks who are part of the movement and doing work on the ground. I'm in this conversation with funders. I'm in this conversation with folks who can connect this organization to resources that I'm part of, but also these other organizations that are here in the room with us. And it really does like create this dynamic of how can we collaboratively support one another, but at the same time, how can we be real with each other, and how can we kindly and respectfully let each other know when we're seeing that, one of the organizations in the room or a couple of the projects in the room need to step up in certain ways, right? They need to focus on work that is affecting frontline communities, or they need to, increase the amount of leadership and engagement that's happening in their organization from people of color, or they need to, focus on the groundwork and work that affects people's material realities, and not only on things that are kind of narrative work and framing or whatever it might be. Like, it allows this space by which projects can get really real with each other and talk with each other and kind of evolve collectively. And at the same time, the folks who have connections to funding and philanthropy are in the room too. And everyone's really learning from one another at such a faster rate than I'm used to seeing anywhere else. So.
Even something as simple as getting to read one another's proposals and review them, right? Normally it goes off to the foundation. It's a black box. You don't even know who else has applied for that grant, let alone get to see exactly what they're saying, let alone be part of the conversation about, well, what should they propose, right? And where are the strengths and weaknesses in your initial idea before you draft into a proposal, which is theoretically part of what we do, maybe one of the points where we could develop more. I want to tell one story too. I think maybe I heard you, Bill, referring to this concern that's always been present about, whether we're taking into account the work that's being done by groups that aren't present within our cohort and our community, because that's a kind of a risk of this. How do we prevent this from being an inside, thing, a little privileged club? And the very first grant that we did in this collaborative way, I think, is an illustration of our capacity to not make that mistake. And over the years too, we've consistently made efforts to have nominations that go beyond just the set of organizations that are part of the immediate community and that have been represented on the council before. But it started with the very first one when the Threshold Funding Circle came to the collaboratory and said, we want to give a $50,000 grant. It's the biggest one we've ever done. We want it to be short cycle, so it's going to happen within the next 3 months. We want you to facilitate a process to figure out where it should go, because we don't know. We want to have a seat at the table. And that's how we got started in all this. There was no notion we were going to do it, for all of the money, even in that cycle, although it went so well that they said, yeah, why don't you do the rest of the money that's going to get distributed, 6 months from now. And then, every year since then, we've done it. But that first one, it came down to 2 different proposals, one of which was from our community. It was a new collaboration among 3 different organizations that, were founding members of the collaboratory. We all knew everybody well. We knew this work well. It was kind of the culmination of our vision, of Leslie's vision, that, more collaboration should be happening. And if we bring groups together into relationship, they'll do that. And here they were, with this new idea. It was everything that we had, hoped to be catalyzing. The other, nominated by one of our members, Movement Generation, but a member that had been a little, they're people of color led collective, really out on the edges of anti-capitalist transformational liberation economics. And they even had said to us before this event, we're not so comfortable bringing our people in to work with you all, because we think you need some anti-racist, anti-oppression training. And so we actually did that. We brought in, before all this was happening, we did a day of training on that. And then they show up and they see, they just saw evidence that had happened. Anyway, they nominated the Climate Justice Alliance, which at the time was fairly new, was not a part of our conversation, was not, was a network that had no direct relationship to any of us, but it was everything we said we wanted to support. It was collaborative, it was frontline, it was translocal, it was addressing climate and social justice, and in the process, food, water, energy, whole systems change. It's just, it was out there and it already happened. And we had the connections for them to come in and say, well, here it is. You really want to fund this work? This is happening. And it was a very close decision, but in the end, we gave them the money. And it was clear in retrospect that that was the right thing to do. It was hard, but the group wisdom, surfaced to say, well, yeah, of course. And so I think that story shows what's possible. Now, again, we did have the relationships in place to have some level of trust. And I think it's a very important question. If something new gets stood up quickly, is that even possible? And what are the dangers? But I also think that that's part of this transformation, is for us to learn, to take risks in some levels in terms of trust, that if we really are going to step up to this moment, we have to do that. It used to be that you welcomed a stranger, right? And I think we somehow need to get back to seeing ourselves as part of one human family in really tangible, risky kinds of ways. Mark?
Yeah, that's beautiful. How do you measure success when you, so I guess 2 questions. First one is, do you, if one of the grantees come back to you and say, well, we need more grant money to, I don't know, whatever, grow or expand our reach, would you fund again? And the second question is, or the first, as you choose, how do you measure success? What's the follow-up with these grantees?
Well, a lot. Are you waving goodbye, Ingrid? Or?
No, you go.
A lot of our recipients have received money over multiple years. So it's kind of, even though we don't give explicitly, we haven't, in theory, I guess we could, but we don't explicitly give multi-year funding commitments, but in practice, it happens. And then they tend to rotate out too after a certain period of time. So that just kind of naturally happens, I think, based on the relationships and the knowledge and familiarity of the work. in terms of measuring success, I think that's, that's been a challenge for us and is a huge challenge in philanthropy in general in terms of metrics. And you have a paradigm that's, in the old existing system that's very dependent on a kind of a linear cause and effect, prove that if we give you X dollars, you'll do, A, B, and C things that will produce these 5 outcomes, and that's not how whole systems change works. So we've not emphasized that. We haven't even emphasized a whole lot of kind of, follow-up reporting on, well, what happened with that money? We do have it as a process. We haven't put a ton of energy into it, to be honest. I'm curious what your take is on this question, Ryan. It could be argued it's a weakness in what we've been able to do, just maybe because of capacity limitations. Because that's the other thing that's so endemic in the whole philanthropic system, is just how much work it is to go after a grant and to do the reporting for it. And our process is intensive too if you participate fully. You don't have to, though. You don't have to be on the council. And I don't think there's any evidence that if you're not on the council, your proposal gets less money. But there are some real questions there.
Yes, and you heard me speak about this before, is what I call unintended consequences. Very often when we look to drive change, we tend to shy away from what we call the unintended consequences and never revisit it, or have questions at the very beginning of the process, and then things go and they go the way they should be going, maybe or maybe not, but revisiting that and answering that question that was never answered is still never answered, even though we have all the elements to answer it at one point. And that creates, again, these processes where I feel very often we keep repeating or implementing the very same solutions with the same, structure that caused the problems in the first place. So the unintended consequences is more, it seems to happen more often in charity work, in the nonprofit world than perhaps in the for-profit, where, well, it's either you make profit, either you close the shop.
Yeah, I mean, Suzanne, yeah.
Just listening to the topics that are happening, how they're interweaving with one another, I wanted to throw in, it seemed like a good time to throw in what I'm doing is, in terms of my goal and what I do now, which is teach nonviolent communication mostly, is because we need a paradigm shift that actually, if it came to be, would cover all these things that you all are talking about. Because it's a lot of people that have heard of nonviolent communication think it's about the conflict resolution thing, and yes, it can help in that, but essentially it's a power with communication versus power over communication. And what I've found in the 26 years I've been teaching it is the hardest thing that we do is let go of power. And so it is a real personal development. I've said some of my greatest personal development and spiritual development has come from the nonviolent communication model, because it has really taught me to be in that place of utter willingness to collaborate in every moment, no matter what my ego thinks the consequences are for me. And so I've written a book called Traditional Education versus Partnership Education, how to use nonviolent communication premises in creating relationships between teachers and students, so that students can grow up in a power with environment, rather than from beginning being trained in power over, by their teachers and their parents and their older siblings and everyone around them. I really think that this issue is the crux of the shift that we need to make as a global society. And so, the idea of bringing people together in a community to really get to know each other, and a big part of that to learn this nonviolent communication model, this power with model, so that as they're growing up, when basically Marshall Rosenberg, the guy who developed it, said, if we want our children to grow up to have the willingness and the understanding to create organizations and institutions where resources are shared, where leaders facilitate rather than try to control, you know, all these kinds of things. They have to experience that as they're growing up. And now, in so many ways, they experience just the opposite. So that's I'm talking about the future, and yet it's got to start now. You know, so that's a big part of what I'm aiming to do as well, and to include that in what I'm doing. And there's one other piece, yeah, the unintended consequences. This is an interesting thing I've learned about. There's almost so often unintended consequences. It just happens, you know, it's part of acting and interacting. So it's how we manage the unintended consequences. You know, do we just get right back in there and say, okay, we've got an unintended consequence. Now let's really sit down and listen to each other, communicate in ways that we really can hear one another. And let's just work through this, whatever it is, you know, rather than going power over and saying, okay, we have to handle this. Okay, I'm going to handle it because I've got more clout than you ever, whatever.
Yeah. No, Suzanne, I completely agree with you. It's. Yeah, I think when you are in a room with people who have that experience, that can happen. But in the type of nonprofit world that I live in, most of the time, the beneficiaries, let's say, have never a say. You never go back to visit a village in Africa, in Congo or in the Amazon, and look, a year later or 6 months later and say, oh, what have we done? What is a change that have occurred in these communities? I often tell the story of, me visiting a community in the Ecuadorian Amazon and visiting it again 6 years later. And the only difference that was in these 6 years was the introduction of this, right? And the change, the impact on children was such that it shocked me, because 6 years before that, I had never seen a child cry in this community. Never. Yeah. They would grab stuff out of their, each other's hand and always, hug at the end. And then suddenly with this, kids started crying. What does that mean, in the long term? I have no idea, right? But if we don't, that is other type of unintended consequences that could be measured, but are completely ignored.
Right. I didn't mean to undermine it at all.
No. But just making, contextually, because you spoke of context, I think it was important for me to add that context.
Yeah, if you allow me, Ben, and all of you. Suzanne, what I'm hearing you saying is the archetypes of some of the system thinking models. This thing that, if we're talking about the colonization or aid support, it's so much money going into that, but it goes around and around. It doesn't fix the problem. Mm-hmm. So what? And then the fixes that backfire is the secondary consequences. So one of the consequences of COVID is the secondary is that, in fact, the teachers are losing their control. Yeah. So the kids are home, and you have something unbelievable is that the teachers in a week's time, every teacher in Norway, they started to learn online to the kids. And the kids are home with their parents, and it's a complete shutdown. So the system. So what is this? And this is that began, and the growth model for education. It's like the teachers are putting a limit to growth instead of making the child grow higher up as its best capacity. So for example, if it was a minister of education versus a minister of learning, how will that unlimited learning and lifelong learning be? But today everything is like grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, and then it pushes the creativity down.
Right. Exactly.
So these things, the problems that backfires and the unintended consequences is now it's an opportunity space for creativity.
This is a positive unintended consequence. And hopefully when we all go back to school, when everybody goes back to school, some of these things will be kept in the system and it won't revert back. And that's why
I have to go in 3 minutes on the half hour, but I just wanted to respond briefly to the like, how do we measure success? Oh,
I think Suzanne sometimes has tricky internet, so.
oh, my bad. I didn't mean to interrupt. I thought that no one was speaking at the moment.
Well, she's frozen, so why don't you?
I was feeling finished.
Oh, okay, good.
Sorry for
There was this time lag where
interruption.
your voice stopped and then Ryan started and your voice came in again. But
I just wanted to respond quickly to the how do we measure success question. And you know, my experience with it is it's so much about the relationships. I mean, it feels so different to be, you know, applying for funding and trying to think of all these like measurables by which we can say, you know, oh, we'll quantify our success in this way and in this way and through these various measurables, than it does to know we're in a room that over time, like our peers are seeing the effect of our work, right? Like we all have different ways of gauging that, like as we go through the funding process, especially when we get to like a second or third year where multiple organizations are in the process as peers, where, you know, throughout the year, we're seeing what people are talking about on social media. We're seeing how people are engaging with different organizations' campaigns. We're seeing like the effect of their work on the ground, or, you know, the reverberation of their work in media and independent media and in like our social spheres and things like that. So we're really getting so much more of an intimate understanding of one another's success like throughout the year, that when it comes time to like have the dialogues with each other or make decisions around funding allocation, each, you know, individual person who's part of an organization that's like sitting in those circles having those discussions, they're bringing in a different piece of the information. And like, you know, we saw that very clearly in our last council session where we got together to decide which nominations were going to get RFPs. It's like, you know, we can read through an organization's nomination and we can see the different, you know, measurables by which they're discussing the success that they've had with various projects in the past. But when it really gets down to it, like when the person that's part of that nomination like recuses themselves from the room and people get to speak to and champion certain things that they've seen these organizations do, or the effects that certain projects work have had in their communities, or also, you know, critique certain things and speak to, you know, why a project or an organization needs to step up in different regards, or why it might not be the most effective thing to fund at that particular moment. Like there's so much deeper understanding in those discussions because we all have relationships with each other as, you know, members of shared movements. Then I think that can be represented in like applying for funding in a way where we're trying to just think of our quantitative, you know, success measurables and kind of speak to those in proposal narratives and things like this. So that's one way that I think success is really like deeply measured through this process.
we're part of an ecosystem. You know, we're like a cross section of an ecosystem of organizations, initiatives doing this kind of community scale transformational work. You know, and so we're just plugged in and sensing things. I think the other thing too is that the DNA of these initiatives is transformational from the get-go. You know, we don't fund anything that's too traditionally focused in terms of, you know, providing band-aids on the harms of the existing system. If you're not working at multiple levels of transformational work intersectionally, you're just not going to get an RFP. So, you know, who knows what really has an impact, right? I mean, we fund training programs that a few people go through and arts things that aren't necessarily creating community ownership of solar power installations or something. But there's, if there isn't something in the how as much as the what, it doesn't get funded, I think. And ultimately the how may be more important than the what. I mean, even solar power, as great as it is, right, there's all kinds of negative impacts to how those materials are sourced and who's putting the panels together and the global supply chain that gets them over here from China. And, but Co-op Power, who's doing, community energy cooperatives across the Northeast, is building relationships in those communities and empowering, people of color and there's just so much else that's going on that even if there are some of these unintended consequences to some of what they're doing, there's also all kinds of positive stuff happening just by the very nature of how they're doing it and who they are.
And I just want to add that I'm really looking at unintended consequences as a learning process that unfortunately does not happen often enough, where we can just say, yeah, we learned that if we introduce that into these communities, that might happen. And then we better prepare next time instead of just going there again intuitively and thinking that we're doing great.
And with indigenous groups, I think there's particularly a danger, right, where your focus has been. I mean, we see a version of it when working with more marginalized and disadvantaged communities here in the US, for example. But I think we have a lot more interconnection that we can work with there, maybe, than in some of the cases of communities that are more, that are more isolated, less integrated into the existing systems.
Right.
And that's the whole value there, is to preserve their, what they have that isn't
From an
coming.
outside.
Well, we should probably, I'm feeling pretty exhausted myself. Should we do a closing round, just briefly? And yeah, I'm just really appreciative of everyone showing up. This I hope it was valuable to all of you. It certainly felt good to just be able to talk about this stuff we've been doing, share it.
Yeah, they definitely, I definitely want to learn more and explore relationship with this group.
That would be great. Yeah, and again, part of it, there's sort of a twofold dimension to what we're doing within Now What. One is to focus on this existing work that we're doing, this particular funding cycle, hopefully gather some more funding to go into it, as well as people that want to learn about it. And as Ryan said, how can we take this out into other contexts, but also to maybe help launch something specific that is this, that's a form of disaster collectivism. So maybe by the end of April, there's actually some momentum. There's a group of people that want to do that work together as a core team. There's a group of organizational and network partners that might want to be a part of this, and maybe some funders that might want to help to make it real from the get-go with some preliminary commitments. I don't know if that's too much to imagine in a few weeks, but that was part of what seemed possible when we planned this.
Are you wanting all of us to chime in?
But you can pass, but yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit from each of you about, what are you taking away? What parting thoughts do you have?
Since I just spoke up, I'll go ahead and go. This was very helpful to me in terms of, just having participated in the process that TRC and Threshold Foundation has created. I was just really impressed at how it's sort of doing jujitsu with the traditional approach. So it was great to hear more in depth stories, anecdotes about it, And I just look forward to sharing, now sharing, I feel like I'm in a position where I can speak and share this, and hopefully it gets taken up elsewhere. I think it's a good culture jamming exercise. So and it was great to also hear from all of you. I really felt like this had a very broad set of experiences that were shared. So thanks to each of you for contributing of yourselves. I'm up.
Well, I'm glad I followed my intuition and ended up here. I've really enjoyed the conversation and meeting all of you that I haven't met before. And I was just leaving with a feeling of hope, hearing that how all of you are trying to work in such sustainable ways and collaborative ways and power with ways, and just really enjoying hearing that. Thank you all.
I will also say thank you, and thank you for allowing me to come from the other side of the ocean and to join you. I really feel the feeling that having this discussion within my own pool locally would not be as grand and beneficial as having this kind of the synthesizing from the different perspectives that we are operating kind of. I will say that in the time I've taken with me today is that food and food security, local producing food, how we do this, come with a way we give power to people, and we cultivate beauty, and we have the deeper value of love for each other in local communities. So that's why I'm very happy to also connect with Ryan, but also with all of you. But the food essence in the local community, together with music and happiness, and gives power to people. Thank you, Susanne, and everybody.
Mark?
Oh, I thought I did.
Maybe you did. Yeah, maybe we're
It
done.
was very short. I thought I spoke enough.
I certainly did too. Yeah, it was great to have Ryan here. He's really, he's been a wonderful addition, and I would love to see him, be part of a team. We have this vision that maybe we could do some consulting based on what we've learned, and I'd love to see him be a part of that along with Leslie and myself, and there are others too. So yeah, we'll see where this all goes. I think from now we're going to move into probably some conversations that are more that are privately organized. So if any of you have particular interests and want to be part of that, Bill was a part of one with Stuart Cowan from the Regenerative Communities Network. We actually have some notes on our Google Doc from that. I think there's a few others that are sort of percolating. We will have the call at the end of April, still setting the time, where we'll be presenting the current docket and doing some site visits to some of the organizations that are up for funding, and talking a bit more about this model, specifically targeted at some funders, but open to anyone. So that'll be on the Now What calendar when we figure out when it's happening. But yeah, if you have more specific interests and want to reach out, or if there are other players you think might be worth connecting with, whether they're coming from the funding side, or I think particularly networks and alliances that could be a conduit for moving money, that have those relationships in place, right? So that we could trust that if we're able to be a bridge to bring funding into them, they would do good things with it. And then that I think, what I'm imagining is that leaders of those different networks form a council, and that's how we could try to play with the model we have now, along with some of the funders that might support it. And maybe it's not a huge scale, but it's a way to start out and just see, does this have a chance to work, by seizing on this moment and the energy that's there. All right, till next time,
Bye,
everyone.
everyone.
Oh, don't forget the